lots of publications, wrote it, Rolling Stone, Reader's Digest. He's written quite a book about the Australian UFO community and the UFO story in Australia, the Oz Files, and now he's got a new one out, Hair of the Alien. And Are You Sitting Down? We're going to be talking today about DNA and forensic evidence of alien abduction. Is it out there? And well, Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Whitley.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you with us. Let's see how we can get into this. Let me just start out by reading something from the frontispiece of Bill's book. The thing is that when I bit her, she didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't react at all in pain. It was as if I took a bite out of a plastic dummy or a mannequin or that was made of rubber or something. The expression on her face was like, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. This isn't the way it's supposed to happen.
It's an extraordinary and a bizarre case, and like so many abduction cases worldwide, I guess one sort of initial reaction, if you're not sort of familiar with this territory, is to kind of reject it. But what we did there was to examine the case because it was not just a story. It had some physical evidence, and fortunately that evidence was of a biological nature, and we could apply some DNA techniques to it to try and unravel what the story was all about.
Now, this is the Curry case, from the Curry case, am I correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about it. Now, what we're going to be talking here, folks. Understand, this is not a story about alien abductions and sort of what went down only. That's part of it. But the biggest part of this story is forensic evidence is being collected now, folks. The world's changing fast. So, Bill, tell us a little bit about this case first.
Well, I first got to know of Peter Curry around about late 91, 92. Essentially, I'd heard that he had an experience rather similar to your own experience that you documented in Communion back in 1987. He had his experience before he became aware of your book, so when he actually was exposed to your book, he was quite startled by the similarities. But of course, there was also a lot of dissimilarities. So, like in many cases, etc., there are always common elements and dissimilar elements. But so he had this experience back in 1988, which involved what appeared to be the traditional grey-type beings, perhaps slightly taller than usual, and the smaller, stocky, darker figures, etc., which involved putting a needle-like probe into his head. And that experience was just, extraordinarily frightening for him, and it literally shattered his entire kind of world view. And
I can speak from experience that there's nothing like having a needle stuck into your head to make you feel a little uneasy.
Yes,
I've been there and done that.
Yes, he was like you, absolutely terrified. That, totally uncertain what this was all about, and it was in fact while he was driving with his fiancée Vivian that there was a local ad campaign going on for the paperback edition, I believe, of your book Communion, and initially just involved the grey alien face that appears on the cover of your book, and when they saw that, they were quite staggered because, particularly Vivian, because she said, "This is what you've been telling me about," referring to her fiancé, and so they couldn't understand what this was about because the campaign was somewhat subtle and clever in the sense that it started off just with the face, and then eventually, after a week or so, it became clear that it was linked to the book, and then when they got hold of the book, Vivian started reading it first, and she kept telling Peter that you're not going to believe this. This is exactly what you've been telling me. And eventually did read the book, and obviously was quite startled. And at least when he got the book, he somehow had some sort of anchor point now that at least he felt that this book, or at least his experience, was something to do with alien abductions. But up to that point, he just wasn't familiar with the field at all.
You know, it's interesting how these books have worked, because the book that set me off on this particular journey was one that my brother, for some bizarre reason, gave me for Christmas that year. in the Christmas of 1985, a book by Jenny Randles, and I had no more idea of the concept of alien abduction than the man in the moon at that time. I would have scoffed at anyone who said such a thing. And, to me, alien abduction and such, it was something that had to do with backwoods people, trailers, and big cases of beer, and possibly blowing a little something on the side in the smoky realm, or even dropping some acid. But it had nothing to do with... go ahead.
This is one of the problems with Peter Curry, is that I know there's a lot of stereotyping that goes on with sort of abductees and what the community and general public think they might be, or what the media portrays them as, but really those stereotypes just aren't appropriate. And Peter was basically from the Lebanese community. His family emigrated to Australia in the early 80s, and as he grew up, he got into a sort of a building career in cement rendering, etc., and a fairly kind of strong kind of character, etc., with very strong kind of family ties, both his own Lebanese family and also to his wife's Greek community as well. And the idea of somebody with that background coming up with an alien abduction experience was just quite strikingly unreal in that sense. And yet here he is describing these experiences. And obviously there was some, attitude of unacceptance from his own family community eventually, but some of the members of his own family were in part witnesses to all these experiences as they slowly unraveled, and as they got into the story in a more detailed way, they realized that Peter was going through a genuine kind of experience.
Well, tell me this: what did he notice in his life? What was he complaining of, and what was he experiencing?
Well, the thing obviously that started it all in terms of the UFO alien context was his 1988 experience. That was clear and explicit and recollected without the benefit of hypnosis. It was just a powerfully sort of life-changing experience. But as he started to try and understand that experience, he started to, like yourself, go back into his own past, and the one experience that seems to stand out as a kind of focal point, or was an experience that he had as a child back in 1971 in Lebanon, and that involved him with a number of other children from the local community at Cheka, a seaside port in Lebanon. They were playing, as most kids do, on the flat top roofs of the buildings, the houses there. Most of them are flat top, and he clearly recollects being the last to go up the staircase, going through the heavy door up onto the roof. And then as he gets through the heavy door onto the roof, he sees that all his friends are frozen like statues, and he looks up and appears to see what he first took to be like a helicopter, but a helicopter nothing like that he'd ever seen before. Most things that are unusual in the sky in those days are all put down to the activities of Israelis, etc., because it was the period of conflict between the Israelis and the Lebanese and Arabic communities there. All he could recollect was that he saw what appeared to be two people inside this sort of unusual object, virtually directly above the roof of the house, and it just seemed to be silently sitting there. And then the next thing he finds himself and all the other kids down at ground level with no recollection how they got there. So it was an interesting kind of experience, and actually much more recently his own mother highlighted an experience that she had when she was 28. When he was 28 years old, she was nursing him in the early hours of the morning, and was somewhat taken back to see what appeared to be sort of a tall, sort of almost handsome-looking man with blonde hair staring through the window at them. She was kind of taken back by this, but couldn't understand what was going on. And bearing in mind this was Lebanon, she had couldn't understand who this person was, and ultimately they tried to put it down to perhaps he was a sailor of some type because it was a seaside port, but certainly a blonde-haired person looking in the window at them with no recollection of how the experience ended was kind of striking. And as his mother got to know of Peter's experiences, I guess she kind of started to place that experience in, I guess, this alien context, and the appearance of blonde-haired people, etc., particularly those with blue eyes and that kind of stuff, is a recurring theme right through UFO lore.
Yes, it is, and you quote me actually in your book, In Hair of the Alien, about the shamanic language of symbol and myth possibly offering a better insight into the visitor's motives. And at that time, they looked upon this as did they look upon this as anything more symbolic, or?
You mean Peter's family?
No. I maybe I'm talking at cross purposes, but when the Kuris saw this in Lebanon when he was a boy, how did they took it? How did they explain to themselves the figure in the window? Just as.
Well, his mother sort of really, I guess, to try and anchor it in some kind of reality, she perhaps sort of took it as initially perhaps a sailor from overseas.
The sailor, yeah, but never
wandering around the streets.
She never went beyond that.
An unrealistic rationalisation, but beyond that, as she became more and more aware of Peter's more recent experiences, she started to realise that maybe there was something quite unusual here. And there were a number of experiences that the Curie household had in Sydney, just leading up to Peter's 88 experience. And
we're going to find out more about those experiences in just a moment from Bill Chalker. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. Before we stopped for that commercial break, we were talking about the realization that built in the Curie family once they were in Australia, something very unusual. Let's just continue on with the story at this point, Bill, and then we're going to get into what makes this case so completely mind-bending.
Well, with Peter's family, there was a number of events that led up to, in retrospect, I'm saying here because really they were seen as disconnected events initially, to the 88 experience, where he had this kind of quite shattering kind of abduction experience with a needle being put into his head. The family started to become aware of the presence of kind of heavy footfalls, or as if there was almost small armies of people walking backwards and forwards up and down the driveway just beside their house, and the menfolk of the family were constantly going out to investigate what the hell this was, and at that point, Peter was kind of like the prodigal son returned home from, I guess, a lifestyle that he grew to regret that he was involved with. He was sort of really going out with the wrong crowd, etc. And ultimately, he left that lifestyle. He felt if he stayed in it, he perhaps wouldn't have been around anymore to enjoy life. So he came back to the family fold. Rediscovered his childhood sweetheart Vivian, and then started to get into the building trade, etc. And sort of life was really good and all that kind of stuff. So there was no kind of stresses going on, but just over a period of several weeks, there was this presence of strange sounds, footfalls, etc. And every time the men went out to try and track down who this was, thinking that it might have been Peter's old friends or something, they were never able to apprehend these people. And if they were, in fact, people trying to create a stir, etc., they felt that there were many occasions where they could have easily apprehended these people, and yet they never were able to discover the source of it. And on one occasion, there was somehow like a silhouette presence at the window where Peter experienced a form of paralysis, and it kind of approximated the kind of much more devastating experience of paralysis that Peter finally had in the 88 experience, which led up to the abduction experience.
Now, let's go on to the 1992 experience. Well, let's first talk about the 88 experience, concentrating, if we can, on the physical evidence, the scoop mark, and so forth. What he must have been rather disturbed to find that, considering the memories that he had.
Well, his immediate point of recourse was to go to his family doctor because he had initially what was this mark on the head where the needle had apparently gone in. That was clear and apparent. He also had this scoop mark on his leg. both points were quite striking, and he went along to his general practitioner, but she unfortunately kind of reacted in a way that kind of devastated Peter. She just sort of kind of laughed at it. He actually started to say to her what had transpired, and he obviously regretted doing that, because she just laughed at him and sort of rationalised these injuries as something that he would have experienced in the building trade. Maybe he sort of nicked his head on a nail or something like this, and similarly sort of collided his leg with some sort of building hardware or whatever. But Peter kind of rejected that, obviously, because he had this kind of direct experience. To him it was quite real and devastating, and so he started to gradually learn, I guess in a baptism of fire, that people who have these sorts of experiences don't get easy kind of feedback or solace from people, etc. It's a very difficult situation.
It sure is. I mean, I had the misfortune to report being raped in my book Communion, and that made me a figure of fun. And it hurts badly to be made a figure of fun for a trauma like that. And I often ask some of the comedians who make jokes about the rectal probe, how would you feel if your wife was raped and everybody laughed? And they don't have a really rejoinder to that. And it's actually not funny. It was a hard experience. It's very, very difficult, and one that left me still to this day traumatized. And I'm sure Peter is in the same exact position as are the other abductees that you talk about in your book. It's a very traumatic thing. Tell us a little bit about exactly what he did remember in '88.
Well, the extended experience was completely there from word go. He describes being in the lounge room of the family house. He was sitting there with his father watching a late night TV program. In fact, the movie had just kind of started. It was quite late in the evening. At that point, his brother came out and asked if Peter wouldn't mind watching the same movie in his own bedroom TV, etc., so that his brother could sit down in his own favourite chair, which Peter had been using, and Peter didn't concern himself about that, decided, yeah, okay, and then went to his own room, and it was literally as he kind of lay down in his own room and closed the door that this experience started to unfold. So there was none of this suggestion that it was a kind of a sleep interface kind of hallucinatory experience or anything like this. The experience started to unfold. This sense of progressive, intense paralysis took over, and Peter became quite terrified that here he was, only 24 years old, starting to have intense paralysis. He kind of thought, what's going on here? He even thought that this was kind of like the sins of the past catching up with him because of his kind of checkered past before he went back to the family fold, and he started to become quite terrified, certainly because there was a kind of a religious context and strong religious tradition within the family, so he kind of linked it almost in with that, some form of retribution perhaps, but he then became suddenly aware of some figures, and discerning those figures and seeing what those figures looked like straight away for him took it away from any sense of religious retribution or karmic revenge or something like that, because here he was seeing figures that were just completely unearthly as far as he was concerned, and these were these grey-like figures that we all have grown to become aware of.
Right.
And they were standing around him, and there were all these little stocky figures standing around him as well. And then one of the figures started to put this needle-like probe into his head, and with some sort of impression of a communication to the effect that don't be concerned, this will be like the last time. Now, Peter had absolutely no awareness of what the last time meant. That to him was kind of incomprehensible, and it was that when the needle was put in that the experience kind of terminated. He has attempted to have some hypnosis. In fact, at one point he had hypnosis with Professor John Mack, and that was probably the one occasion, apart from another, where some element of recollection did start to come out as to what might have occurred in that period of missing time. and that was the sense that he was in some sort of strange environment, aware of some sort of presences around him, but the overwhelming sense of the whole swarm of sort of high-pitched bird-like noises all coming as if there were many, many of them, sort of all communicating at once. And he was sort of seized by the thought, well, how am I supposed to understand this? He couldn't understand the communication that was kind of going on, and at that point there was no kind of further recollection. But despite attempts to undertake hypnosis to understand what happened there, he has never really been able to get any more information about that.
Yeah, never, exactly, and that's so true in so many of these cases, that the information just doesn't come at all. I know that the Karina Sable's case in British Columbia is an equally arresting case and a very, very powerful multiple witness case. And there's just not a lot of information there either. It's as if the person is put into a state of suspended animation, and you have to wonder what it is that is going on, because we don't seem to be harmed at all. And this gets me now to the physical evidence in this case. Now, this is the 1992 event in Peter's life. And before we get into the DNA results that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes, it's necessary for you, Bill, if you will, to set the scene for us, because this was very different in terms of the amount of memory he had and the nature of what happened and when it happened. There's one question I want to, before we leave 1988. This occurred in his room while other people in the house were wide awake.
That's the 88 experience.
Yeah, the 88 experience did.
Yes.
And
the 92 experience, he was home alone.
Right. Now I'm not quite ready to go on the 92 experience, because I know that there'll be listeners who are interested to know if anyone in the house was aware of anything that happened.
Well, as I said, with an 88 experience, his father and brother were in the lounge room adjacent to the bedroom where the experience unfolded with Peter. When Peter at the end of the experience, he came out of the bedroom and then he found his father and brother in a state of almost like they were just switched off. In fact, his brother kind of used those words, that he was kind of groggy, and it was really, to his brother, an experience that he was kind of totally unfamiliar with. He hadn't experienced anything like that before. He's always been a bit of a kind of a light sleeper, and yet here he had been sort of kind of switched off, and here's his brother telling him some sort of bizarre story of something that had just happened to him, and it was kind of all too much for his brother, kind of stuff, and he started to reject what his brother was telling him, but ultimately he started to ultimately believe what his brother had to say. His father was just totally confused by it, but nevertheless they were certainly aware that something unusual had happened even to themselves, but it took them quite some time to get the whole sort of summation of what Peter was trying to convey to them that had happened, and obviously they started to interpret it initially in a religious context, even thought that Peter had been visited by Saint Charbel, which is the first sort of Catholic saint in the Lebanese kind of religious context, but only because some of these figures appeared to wear robes, and Saint Charbel was aware of robes and that kind of stuff. But those kind of rationalizations, even within his family, just didn't have any kind of satisfactory resolution for Peter, and so that's why he started on this search to try and understand what was going on.
And a search, exactly, that is still, like mine, I guess it'll go on for the rest of his life. Now let's go to 1992. Set the scene for us, if you will, and tell us where exactly was he, and what, oh, well, wait a minute, we've come up on a break, so folks, hold on to your hats. When we come back with Bill Chalker, you're going to be getting into something you've never gotten into before. This is Whitley Strieber. We'll be right back. We're back with Bill Chalker talking about his wonderful new book, Hair of the Alien, DNA and Other Forensic Evidence of Alien Abduction. How times have changed. If only back in 1985 I had had some hair of the alien instead of having to go on to program after program to the tune of the Twilight Zone and feel the agony of having people laughing in my face. Again and again and again, millions of them for many, many years. It's hard. But I didn't. Now, however, that's changing, and thank goodness. So, Bill, tell us about Peter Curry's 1992 experience. What unfolded? How did it start?
Well, the experience for him, it unfolded in his own bedroom now. This, I have to explain, he was actually recovering from head injuries that he'd received in a job site assault. It turned out to be a dispute related to other people within the Lebanese community who had appropriated Peter's building equipment and were using it, and sort of ended up half wrecking the equipment, etc., and leaving it in a pretty bad state. And Peter started to have an argument with these people, and instead of trying to resolve it, as Peter was trying to do in a kind of a amicable way to just clean the equipment up, a couple of the people involved in this turned around and lashed out at Peter and hit him over the head with a shovel, and ended up really assaulting him extremely badly. The whole thing ended up in a sort of a court situation and was resolved. But even though Peter received compensation, it left him with some head injuries. Now, during that period, he was under some medication, and also it had some partial brain swelling, so people could probably, I guess, try to rationalise this away as something to do with hallucinations or whatever, or fantasies or whatever, but ultimately one has to deal with the physical evidence, which I'll get into in a minute. But there he was. He'd just dropped his wife off at the railway station so she could go to work. She was the breadwinner at that time because Peter had been off work for some time because of this injury. He'd returned home, and this was about 7:30 in the morning. Went home. Because he wasn't feeling well, he promptly laid down on the bed, had the sheet over him. He was just sitting in a kind of we call them sloppy joes, or kind of a tracksuit type of arrangement under the sheet, etc. So he was clothed. And then he feels he went off to sleep at that stage. Then suddenly he's awoken by the sense that somehow something light had sort of stepped onto the bed. And it was at that point he was sort of awoken. But at that point he had some sort of strange sensory perception effect going on, that it seemed to him that he was kind of looking through a transparent shell of himself, almost like an out-of-the-body kind of thing, but he was kind of looking through a transparent presence of himself, and through that he could see two strange female figures on the edge of the bed, both naked. But that transparent sense of himself only lasted momentarily, and then all of a sudden he's in what he regarded as clear and unambiguous physical reality, the real world sort of thing, and yet what was before him was quite strange. One has to bear in mind he's inside a locked house, and two women. Now, to many that could be seen like a sexual fantasy, but to Peter this was not a sexual fantasy. It was kind of real and startling and bizarre, and clearly something that was he just wasn't prepared for. And what unfolded was that there was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman that looked, for all intents and purposes, almost Caucasian-like or Nordic-like or Scandinavian-like, but she had a very strong, angular, pointed chin. The eyes themselves seemed to be very large. He described them as 2 to 3 times the size of normal human eyes. And so while both women seemed to be human-like, they had features that made them more, stand out and look quite strange. The blonde woman was actually straddling Peter around the upper leg area, so she was quite close to him. The other woman was a very brown-skinned, Asian-looking woman with jet black hair. and she just seemed to be quietly sitting at the edge of the bed, seemingly observing what's happening here. The blonde woman then seized Peter and pulled him to her breast and did this about 3 times, as if trying to carry out some kind of interaction with Peter. And Peter, unfortunately, is claustrophobic at the best of times, and this he found kind of very upsetting and kind of overpowering. And as I explained earlier, Peter works in the building industry, quite a strong man, and he found her strength quite surprising, quite shocking, that he had to confess that she seemed stronger than him, and this kind of worried him a fair bit, and then this kind of interaction continued, and then he tried to force her away and ultimately couldn't, and then that's when he did what he still has trouble trying to reconcile today, but he ended up biting her on the nipple area, and that seemed to stop it. But what surprised him with the intensity of it was that she didn't seem to react in any way as if she'd been injured, and yet anybody, if it had been a woman in a straightforward sense, there would have been a very severe reaction of extreme, excruciating pain, and yet she just seemed to react. And according to Peter, he got this sense of a communication between the blonde woman and the Asian woman to the effect that this is not the way it's supposed to happen. And then at that point, Peter reacted, starting an acute coughing fit, as if he had somehow ingested some part of this woman's flesh, and was acutely coughing, and at that point he put his head down, coughing away quite violently, and then he looked up, and within a matter of seconds it seemed that the 2 women had vanished as quickly as they had arrived, and at that point Peter was completely disorientated, had gone to the bathroom to try and stop this coughing fit that he was having, drank a glass of water, still couldn't stop the coughing, but after drinking the water, he was seized with this urgent need to go to the toilet, and that's what he tried to do. And it was at that point he experienced severe pain in the genital area, and it was at that point that he found the presence of these 2 fine wisps of white hair attached to his penis area, and it was only because of the nature of the experience and the kind of experiences that he had had previous to that he realized that this had something to do, no matter how bizarre it had something to do with this kind of alien abduction experience that he'd been going through and trying to come to terms with, and that's why he had the presence of mind, and I guess we can be thankful for that he preserved those 2 hair samples, put them into a plastic bag, and then put them in a filing cabinet, and it was that preservation act that really, I guess, made the story all the more interesting, because without that evidence, that story would have been just another quite bizarre and seemingly unbelievable sort of abduction experience.
Well, yeah, especially because of his head injury and brain swelling. I think even you, as a researcher, would have probably said to yourself, well, this is a case of a guy who maybe has had some experiences in the past, and now that he's in this vulnerable state, the thing came back to bite him. But that isn't the whole story by any means. Not only is there the hair, which we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes, there's also the past. And you mentioned that Thomas Knightley, in his 1880 study, The Fairy Mythology, tells a remarkable story about a farm boy who, in Jutland, who found himself confronted by a very pretty girl who wouldn't let him see her back, and he decided that she must be an elf maid because they were reputed to be hollow. Now, which is in and of itself a suggestion that it's maybe the reason she wasn't particularly concerned about being bitten was that on some level she wasn't actually there, except perhaps for her hair. It's wonderful the way this thing twists and turns and always gets away from you when you try to pin it down. Now,
yeah, that story was conveyed to me recently because it also had that striking feature of this blonde-haired woman trying to get the young man to also suck on a breast, etc. So it had even that bizarre element that Peter reports here in a Danish account, a Danish folkloric account. So it's quite striking from that point of view.
He did suck, and he was gone for 3 days. This kid, the one in the Danish account, I mean, not Peter.
That's right. And so it has this kind of bizarre element that goes on, and there's a lot of this kind of resonance between the old traditional fairy lore traditions of abductions and that kind of stuff that resonate fairly powerfully with modern-day alien abduction experiences.
Now, this woman, I don't think we touched on her complexion. She was Nordic sort of looking, but how white was her skin? Was it chalk white?
Yeah, extremely white. She had a fairly white complexion, and that was strikingly different to the Asian-looking woman who appeared to have a quite dark brown complexion.
We've come up on another break. This is Whitley Strieber, and we'll be right back. We're talking to Bill Chalker. His book, Hair of the Alien, DNA and Other Forensic Evidence of Alien Abduction, available from the UnknownCountry.com store, available in bookstores everywhere. Why should you get this? Well, because it's just, frankly, it's loads of fun to read about these cases. Even though I have had this, I have been roughed up by it, and sometimes it's difficult for me to read about these. The fascination level is so high, especially in this case and in this book, because suddenly it doesn't stop with the story. Let's get into the DNA evidence now, Bill.
Well, this is what makes this story so interesting, because like a lot of researchers, I know it's obviously different to people who have gone through this experience like yourself. You have this certainty that comes with personal experience, but for a researcher like myself, it's you investigate these stories and research these stories, and while you are obviously impressed with the conviction and the certainty that people have with these experiences, more often than not, the physical evidence of these experiences is often ambiguous. The idea of scoop marks and that kind of thing only sort of convey up to a certain point the sense of reality going on here, and suggestions of implants are intriguing as well, but ultimately a lot of that remains ambiguous but suggestive as well. And so as a researcher, from a scientific point of view, I was trying to look at these experiences to see whether there was anything that could be examined, and with a number of sort of scientists that were joining me in a kind of a somewhat more clandestine approach, because some of these scientists were concerned about their own career paths. They were fascinated by the subject but wanted to investigate it. I was joined by biological scientists, biochemists, etc., and that allowed us to perhaps focus on the biological potential of abduction subjects, and we kind of concluded in our kind of brainstorming that if these experiences were real, they should surely have some kind of biological consequences in the sense of a forensic kind of point of view. And so if you look at abductions as an assault on the individual, almost like a crime scene, one could, rationalise that surely there must be some sort of tangible proof that could be found. And when those biochemists were talking in those terms, I drew to their attention that yes, perhaps there is an example of biological evidence that we could look at, and that was Peter Curie's case that had this hair sample, and I became aware of it and investigated it with Peter, and he only told me about that very, very sort of reluctantly, because it was so bizarre, so unreal even to him, and he eventually passed the sample on to us, and we then, with the help of the biochemists, started to examine this in a process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. This is the backbone of the whole DNA profiling that people are quite familiar with shows like CSI and that kind of stuff. But the process that we did was a little bit more complex than that. But we decided to apply those kind of detailed scientific forensic tests to Peter's hair. And Peter, I made aware of that that he was taking a bit of a risk here because of the bizarre nature of it. Some people might have argued that this is some bizarre cover story to having some sort of quite terrestrial affair, perhaps, and that if the DNA turned out to be quite mundane, as actually I expected it to be, he would have had a lot of explaining to do with his wife, etc., and that kind of thing. But Peter was absolutely certain about the nature of the experience, the bizarre nature of it, that he almost insisted on it and was really pleased that the opportunity came along. So to cut a long story short, we examined the DNA of the hair in two phases. We looked at the shaft of the hair, and when we examined that, and this is a blonde hair sample, we ended up getting quite strange and unexpected, a very rare Asian Mongoloid DNA. And given that most people that have that kind of DNA sequence, you would expect that hair to be quite dark or black, and yet here we had it in a blonde hair sample, and that straight away was a very strange anomaly. It wasn't due to albinism, and it wasn't due to hair dyeing, because hair dyeing degrades the quality of the DNA, and you'd still be able to get the theoretically Caucasian DNA coming out quite explicitly. But so that we had a clear kind of anomaly to deal with, and it was on that basis that we came out with the first reporting of it way back in '99, and that caused a fair bit of a stir at the time. But ultimately, we then took it to the next phase, which we knew was going to be more difficult, and that was to examine the root of the hair, because the hair shaft DNA we were looking at was mitochondrial DNA, and that's available in much greater amounts. What's available in less amounts, and often much more fragile, is nuclear DNA, and so we were both interested in mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA in the root of the hair. And when we examined that, we found not only confirmation of the rare Asian Mongoloid DNA, but we also got what appeared to be almost like a sense of a hybrid DNA sequence going on, where we got evidence of this rare Basque Gaelic DNA. And that in
from
itself...
European. In other words, the same hair had DNA from European origins and from Chinese origins and from rare European and Chinese origins.
That was quite startling to the biochemists.
Well, of course, but how could that even be? I mean, it's like it's hair from two different people that had somehow been melded together, or what exactly are we looking at here?
Yeah, well, the DNA scientists felt that, there is a rare kind of DNA effect that goes on that's called heteroplasmy, where very small differences in DNA sequences can be seen and observed. But here we had quite large differences, and so we couldn't explain it through that sort of mechanism of heteroplasmy. And so from that point of view, we had quite a bizarre anomaly on, but kind of providence sort of set in. Here we're talking in the early 2001, Nature magazine, one of the most prestigious science magazines, had come out with a paper on that described cutting-edge cloning techniques that were being addressed to trying to cure baldness, etc., in humans, etc., in human males particularly, of course. And they had established a technique that involved cloning techniques. Now, these cloning techniques we were interested in actually because the actual hair that came from it highlighted almost an analog type of situation to the what we were seeing in this 1992 sample from Peter. Yet there was no way that Peter's sample could have been due to human cloning techniques, because they just weren't available at the time that he got the sample. But it gave us a kind of an anchor point that, yes, even our own human technology was starting to nudge this technique, or nudge this thing, and here we were seeing something similar, not exactly the same certainly, but something similar in this unusual hair sample that Peter had found. And if that wasn't enough, we actually did get some nuclear DNA, and that nuclear DNA gave us an indication that the donor of this sample also had a DNA factor that's quite striking, but unfortunately rather rare, and that is this what's referred to as CCR5 deletion factor. And that factor, if it's present in your DNA sequence, can confirm to that person immunity to things like HIV, AIDS, and smallpox. So the totality of these DNA findings suggest that just in this one individual, the donor, we have a very bizarre DNA profile with some very unusual characteristics. So that really was quite striking for myself and also particularly for the biochemists dealing with this.
You know, we've had a gentleman on this program called Charles Hall who talks about these tall, very white beings that he saw at Nellis Air Force Base in the U.S. Was this woman? She was short, though, wasn't she? Or he perceived her to be?
Well, no, she actually seemed to be about his height, or around about 6 feet tall.
Yeah, but in other words,
a little bit taller.
Not unusually tall. But then again, these beings, she was quite young or young looking, and they said it's said that they grow as they grow older. They keep growing, get taller and taller. Goodness, I wonder sometimes. I had a hard time believing the story of the tall whites, frankly. But this is such a strange tale in and of itself, because here's a man with a brain swelling and a head injury who has what seems like a hallucination, and then it's oddly paralleled in the fairy lore, and he turns out to have hair samples with essentially inexplicable DNA. Where does this? What is the truth, Bill? What is this world that we live in, really? Give me your kind of bottom line. We're about to finish with Dreamland, and I'm going to keep Bill Chalker on the line for you subscribers, because we got a lot more to talk about. I'm just getting rolling here, and I think Bill is too. But give us a sort of an idea to conclude this Dreamland. What do you think is maybe going on a larger scale?
Well, it seems to me that we have sort of clear evidence that there is some sort of bizarre intrusion going on in our world by beings that seemingly are human, but also they seem to be intruding into our world in concert with the kind of figures that we all seem to be familiar with in the abduction field, and that is these Grail type beings. And so these figures seem to be working together with each other, and when you start to look at it in that context, you then start to get some interesting resonances with our mythic past, particularly with stories of, particularly when you go back into the Gaelic world and the Celtic world, where you start to see traditions such as the Tuatha De Danann, where you have these tall, often fair-haired type of humans that were part of a very strange invasion of Ireland. They didn't invade Ireland in the traditional sense. They didn't come by ships. They came by aerial ships that landed on mountaintops, etc. And yet these same Tuatha De Danann people that were deemed to be tall, they themselves were supplanted by a subsequent invasion of Ireland as well, and yet the tradition has it that the Tuatha De Danann then went into the underworld, and then we know them now in traditional fairy lore. They became the Cid, the whole fairy type tradition, and yet the fairies were traditionally associated with diminutive kind of figures, etc. And so we have this kind of duality going on of tall, blonde, fair-haired people and smaller, diminutive type people. And where do we see that happening today? We see it happening in UFO abduction lore contexts, yes, and that kind of thing. The Nordics and the Greys.
It's the same phenomenon restated in a different way by a culture that has more experience of scientific realities. Bill, thank you.
What's truly startling for me is that it's coming to me via DNA evidence and clues in the DNA evidence. So.
Well, that's exactly right, and it is incredibly startling because, here we're talking about fairy lore, we're talking about UFO abductions, we're talking about strange dreamlike experiences of people who you can bite without hurting, who leave hair behind, and it really is weird, just like you would think it would have to be, but doesn't it in the end come down to somebody who is as physical as we are, and that's where we're going to be going in the subscribers section. If you haven't subscribed yet to Unknown Country, you know how to keep this website going. This is an enthralling journey we're on here, so stay with us. Subscribe to Unknown Country right now, and you can find out Just what Bill is about to tell me. This is Whitley Strieber. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science, discovery, and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts that others dare not. This week she has major breaking news. The largest melt of ice in the history of the Arctic for years. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Before I begin this important update on the largest Arctic ice melt in human record, I would like to let our Earth Files and Dreamland audiences know about two important conferences upcoming in November. The first one is a month from now, November 4th to the 6th. It is the third annual UFO Crash Retrieval Conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, organized by Bob and Ryan Wood. The father and son team have assembled a large collection of leaked documents about government knowledge and cover-up of a non-human presence on this planet. Their conference will be held at the Las Vegas Embassy Suites Hotel and Convention Center. I'll be speaking about an alleged 1953 crash that might be linked to the same time frame as the alleged Kingman, Arizona UFO crash of May 20, 1953. Nick Redfern will present new information about that Kingman case. There will be more than a dozen speakers and presentations, such as Dr. Robert Wood talking about reverse engineering, and Army Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso. Colonel Corso authored before his death what I think is a very important book, The Day After Roswell, about our government's efforts to back engineer advanced extraterrestrial technologies. Another speaker will be Tom Vallone, who has a long professional background in the U.S. Patent Office. His topic is future energy technology and field propulsion. Richard Dolan will present UFO secrecy, political and ethical implications. Peter Robbins will present his longtime research about Wilhelm Reich, Orgone energy, and UFOs. Britain's UFO investigator Philip Mantle will take a new look at the controversial alien autopsy film that emerged in the mid-1990s from a media producer in London named Ray Santilli. Ryan Wood will talk about his new book, Magic Eyes Only, Earth's Encounters with Extraterrestrial Technology, which describes 75 UFO crash retrieval cases and subsequent military cover-up of physical evidence. And on Saturday night, November 5th, the banquet and keynote speaker will be journalist Jim Marrs, author of Crossfire and many other books, including Alien Agenda, about the complexities of the UFO phenomena. Jim is one of the more entertaining people on the planet, and his banquet speech is entitled, Will the Rocket Engine Go the Way of the Dodos? That banquet will definitely be worth attending, and you can buy a ticket for only the banquet or the conference or both combined. I hope many of you in the Dreamland and Earth Files audiences can make it. I would like to meet you and shake your hand, hear your questions. So write down this website address where you can click on the third annual UFO Crash Retrieval Conference ticket and registration information. That's www.majesticdocuments.com. Again, www.majesticdocuments.com. Another important Earth mystery is the crop circle phenomenon. And in mid-November, Callista and Chet Snow, he's the author of the 1989 classic book Mass Dreams of the Future, they will host their Six Signs of Destiny conference in the beautiful Phoenix suburb of Tempe, Arizona. The 4-day conference from November 18th to the 21st is at the Tempe Embassy Suites Hotel. The theme this year is crop circles, Mary Magdalene, and sacred geometry. I'll be doing a lecture about the very strange and unidentified machines seen hovering at the tops of wheat near Lockridge, England in June. I'll also be doing a workshop on the 2005 British formations linked to the Mayan calendar, and perhaps even a ticking clock, plus beautiful and unusual crop formations far beyond Wiltshire, which were not much publicized. I'll be showing lots of photographs and videotape. A highlight of the conference will be the Saturday evening keynote address on November 19th by John Michell, well-respected British author of several outstanding books, including The New View over Atlantis. John will present Crop Circle Enlightenment, Number, Creative Geometry, and Renewal of Ancient Knowledge. John says, quote, as each year produces marvelous new designs, it appears that the crop formations are working to a purpose. They are drawing attention to a forgotten code of knowledge based on number, music, and creative geometry, unquote. So I hope a lot of our Dreamland and Earth Files audiences can make this important Crop Circle conference. I would like to meet and talk with you, so please write down this website address for ticket and registration information. That's www.chetSnow.com/signs.html. I also have links to both of these conferences on my Earth Files news headlines at www.earthfiles.com. One of the persistent themes in the crop formation mystery has been, are the patterns trying to warn us about future events that will affect the environment of our planet, our solar system, our galaxy, our universe? One increasingly important subject for everyone on Earth is global warming and the consequence of more intense storms in some regions, growing drought in others, and the rapid melting of ice from mountain glaciers in the Antarctic, which causes sea level rise. Now, this week comes news from NASA and the National Snow and Ice Data Center at the University of Colorado that the Arctic ice, which floats at the North Pole, melted to its smallest size ever on record going back for at least a century. I have a graphic at my news website, earthfiles.com, that shows the steady decline of ice at the Arctic with a big drop in 2005 in the summer. Since the big North Polar Cap ice floats, its melting does not contribute to sea level rise, but why it's melting so much is directly linked to global warming and an annual trend toward warmer temperatures in the Arctic. Permafrost is melting, roads are buckling, houses are sinking, and polar bears are faced with extinction, since those mighty animals work from the ice to feed off of fish and seals. The summer of 2005, so much Arctic ice melted that ships could travel through both the northeast and northwest passages. Based on the hard data of water and air temperatures that continue to rise each summer, current computer models for the Arctic indicate there will be no ice at all during Arctic summers in another 50 or 60 years. Some scientists even wonder if the Arctic ice melt is happening so rapidly that the hands on the computer clock have to be moved back, maybe to only 3 or 4 decades from now. This week I talked with Mark Serez, PhD, about the persistent and increasing Arctic summer ice melt the past 4 years. Dr. Serez has been a research scientist for 15 years at the National Snow and Ice Data Center at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Here now is Dr. Serez.
In the past 4 years, that downward trend has radically accelerated. 2002, 2003, 2004, as well as 2005, we saw extreme losses of Arctic sea ice cover, and it turns out that 2005 sets a new record in this satellite era. We could compare this to the record we had previously, which was just a few years ago in 2002. This was at about 5.6 million square kilometers of the ice of the Arctic Ocean covered by ice at that time, compared to 2005, which is about 5.3. Now, that difference is about the size of the state of the Colorado, so it's a fairly large change. But if we look at even more spectacular, if we look at 2005 compared to the long-term average, in other words, what we would expect from average conditions, we find that the amount of ice that we lost in 2005 is roughly equal to the size of Alaska, or in turn about twice the size of Texas.
Has 2005 had the largest melt of Arctic ice?
Yeah. From what we can tell, one of the things we also know is that the length of the melt season in the Arctic has increased, and it appears that the duration of the melt in 2005 has also been extremely remarkable. What we've been doing is the last 4 years, year after year after year, we've been seeing these extreme losses of the sea ice cover. So that's the interesting thing here, not just one particularly low year, but that it seems to be a common trait of the system now.
And what is it about the melting of the ice, which is white, that exacerbates the warming?
Well, sea ice is very reflective. That is, it's white. If you look at sea ice, it's basically white, which means that it reflects most of the sun's energy right back up into space. So what we've been doing is trying to reduce this area of the Arctic Ocean covered by sea ice. So what we do is we start to expose areas of open ocean. This is dark open ocean instead of ice. Well, now in those dark ocean areas, well, those are areas where you can now absorb a great deal of the sun's energy. So we start to have a situation now where we absorb more sun's energy into the oceans start to heat up. Well, if the oceans start to heat up, that means it's much harder to grow ice the following fall and winter. So the ice that we get the next spring tends to be thinner, and we don't have as much of it, which means that even more of it can disappear that next summer, leaving even more of this open water, meaning even more absorption of the heat, more ice melt, and so on. A vicious cycle, if you will, but it's something we call a positive feedback. And this is one of the processes we think that is now starting to kick in the Arctic, one of the processes that helps us to explain some of these big reductions.
And if this has been happening now for 4 years in a row, and the likelihood is that next year and the year after and so forth, that the Arctic ice will melt each summer, does that mean that the computer model projection that the Arctic will be entirely ice-free during the summer will be much earlier than 2070?
It possibly could happen earlier, yeah. It's hard to say. One of the things we know, of course, is that these climate models, there are very best representations of how the climate system works, but they're certainly imperfect. And one of the real problems is that in the Arctic there are complex processes which are very, very hard to incorporate properly into these numerical models. And this sort of feedback I talked about, this feedback involving the sea ice and the oceans warming, this is one of the very things that these sorts of models have difficulty in dealing with. So there are uncertainties here. Could it happen earlier? Could we lose that ice earlier than some of these models project? Certainly. Might it be later than some of these models project? That could be as well. But I think the general picture is that there's a pretty decent agreement now between what these models are saying and what the observations are saying.
And what is the downside of losing the Arctic ice in the summer?
Well, it depends on how you want to look at it. In terms of local effects, certainly there's going to be a lot of influences. One of them would be coastal erosion, for example. Already you are seeing villages in coastal Siberia and Alaska that are having to be evacuated or removed because of coastal erosion. Because what's happening here is as you lose that sea ice cover, you expose this open ocean, and then much larger waves can form. The winds can blow over this open water, cause large waves, coastal erosion result. The effect is exacerbated, at least locally, by the fact that in some areas we're starting to warm and melt permafrost. Permafrost is perennially frozen ground. And it's sort of, you can think of it as the glue which holds the soil together. Well, you're starting to warm and melt some of that permafrost. So that just goes hand in hand with coastal erosion. So that's one thing, a local problem. Also, certainly in terms of the people who live there and the animals that live there. There are some people out there saying now that in the next century, polar bears might become extinct, for example, because the polar bears require that ice to live on. Their livelihoods are based on the existence of that ice. Many things like that. But that's sort of, things that happen in the Arctic itself. The bigger question is, how might the changes in the Arctic translate to changes, say, in the mid-latitudes, to places in the United States, places in the UK, and Russia? How might the Arctic changes affect the climate there? And these are one of the things that we have to be careful about in terms of surprises. Could there be a surprise that we're not ready for? Some large-scale reorganization of the atmospheric circulation, for example, that all of a sudden places the southwestern United States in a long-term drought or something. In fact, there's been climate model simulations that show just that, okay? So that's just one example of the sorts of things that may happen. Will that happen? Will you see drought in the southwestern United States associated with a changing Arctic? Well, maybe, maybe not. But it's just one example of the sorts of things that we have to be aware of and ready for.
Some scientists this year that I have interviewed have stressed that it is the rapidity with which the warming is taking place that surprises them, and that if the rapidity increases from glacier melts in Peru and the Himalayas to the Arctic ice and so forth, that it means then that the clock in the computer models has to be speeded up?
That could be true. That could be true. I mean, if we look at these changes in the Arctic, one that we've been talking about, we've just been flabbergasted at the rapidity of the changes. Maybe we have to set those clocks forward. But the thing we always have to remember is that the Arctic always has been highly variable, and it will always be highly variable.
What do you personally worry about the most for the U.S. future?
What do I personally worry about most for the U.S. future? I would say ignorance and complacency. We seem to think of the effects of greenhouse warming as something that we don't have to worry about, that maybe our grandchildren will have to worry about it, maybe their grandchildren. But if you ask me, I think it's starting now. Okay? It's not something that's going to happen far into the future. It's a problem that's starting to be felt now. And I think it's the complacency that worries me, that we just let the problem fester until it's really too late to deal with it.
And in the computer models, is there a link between the intensity of the hurricanes as we're seeing in what may be a natural Earth cycle, but also the intensity of Katrina even surprised the National Weather Service?
Right.
Could it be linked to the fact that the ice melt in the Arctic in the summer was changing some kind of global intensity of moisture and wind?
Mm-hmm. The arguments for and against a link between a global warming and the increasing intensity and numbers of hurricanes is very controversial at this point. Very, very controversial, and it's getting very polarized. From a global warming perspective, a greenhouse perspective, certainly there's some good arguments there. If we think about these hurricanes, what do hurricanes feed on? They feed on warm oceans. And the idea is if we, of course, warm up the planet with greenhouse gases, the oceans warm. That means the oceans have better fuel. They can better fuel themselves so that we might expect stronger, more intense hurricanes. But we also know that the frequency and intensity of hurricanes does show strong natural variability. There are strong natural cycles to that, and we appear to be in a cycle right now, part of the cycle, where it's particularly warm, say out the Gulf of Mexico, and this gives us much stronger hurricanes. But so the question is, well, might we, if there might still, okay, we understand that there's a natural cycle to this, but might we be hitting it with greenhouse gases in such a way that now there's an additional whammy on the system, there's an additional factor to be involved here? That's one of the million-dollar questions. And you'll find a lot of very, very solid scientists saying, no, there is no link between greenhouse warming and the intensity of hurricanes. There are also a number of very good scientists arguing that there is a link. Very controversial, a lot of very good people working on it, and hopefully we'll have some answer to that fairly soon.
Well, common sense would say that if the oceans are warming, Arctic ice is melting rapidly,
that there has to be some kind of link between the warming of the oceans, hurricane intensity, the melting of the Arctic ice.
That's right, but a link in terms of both being forced by the same thing, in terms of both being forced in some way by a greenhouse warming. But the argument, you can't really make the argument that the changes we're seeing in the Arctic have some direct cause and effect link with the hurricanes. In other words, we can't say that, all right, we warm in the Arctic, something sets in motion now that says that hurricanes are more intense. No, there's no evidence for that I am aware of. The evidence is much better that both are responding to the same basic forcing, that is a greenhouse warming.
I'm also curious what your perspective is on the influence and contribution of cycles in the sun to what is happening with global warming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something to it. There's certainly something to the solar variability. Now, on the one hand, you've got a number of scientists that like to conveniently brush that under the rug. Okay. On the other hand, you have a number of scientists who are saying that no, there are very strong solar influences on climate. And I think that the best evidence is, yes, there is a link between solar variability and climate. The question is how strong. Now, it appears that part of the warming that we've seen in the 20th century, over the globe, part of that is due to solar influences. But it seems to be increasingly swamped by a greenhouse effect, or at least that's the argument. But solar variability is not the sort of thing you just want to brush under the rug. Because we just think about the climate system as a whole. What's the ultimate driver of the climate system? The sun. The sun is the ultimate driver. So it makes sense that if you're going to be thinking about climate change, climate variability, the sun is one of the places you want to be looking at. That's the ultimate driver of the system. So there certainly are solar influences on climate. Just how those work, it's not quite clear.
The last time that the Arctic was as warm or warmer than it is now was 130,000 years ago. That was a period between ice ages called the Eemian Interglacial. That warmth lasted for about 20,000 years. Then there was a sudden cooling at 110,000 years ago, and that cooling went on for about 40,000 years, twice as long as the Eemian warm period. Most of northern Europe and Canada became covered by thick ice sheets because snow and ice never melted. Then, about 60,000 years ago, there was another sudden warming that lasted about 30,000 years, and that brings us to about 30,000 years ago when the Earth went into another deep freeze in which ice sheets spread across the northern latitudes, and that was called the last glacial maximum. Finally, about 12,000 years ago, the planet entered another warming phase, which has been going on ever since, and has been intensified the past 100 years by the industrial age, which has put so much carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere. What's fascinating in this global climate research are the somewhat regular cycles of heating and warming before the industrial age. I have a graphic at my news website, www.earthfiles.com, that shows over the past 750,000 years of Earth's history, ice ages have occurred at approximately every 100,000 years. Scientists are learning that the 100,000-year cycle might be caused by variations in the shape of the Earth's elliptical orbit. That would be an astronomical cause. But the unstable nature of the Earth's climate history suggests that it might change suddenly in the future. And what some scientists today fear is that human greenhouse gases could cause an unstable change that we might regret. As Columbia University geophysicist Wally Broker told me, quote, "Climate is an angry beast, and we are poking it with sticks," unquote. So, Whitley, you and I have talked about these subjects so much in the last
times.
2 or 3 years. But this new data, and as Dr. Serez told me, 4 years in a row, each year getting more and more and more melt in the Arctic, is definitely consistent with all of the computer models of greenhouse gas buildup that is exacerbating global warming.
Well, Linda, in the past, time and again, in fact, I think 11 times in the past 2.8 million years, there has been this process where there's been a long ice age followed by a period when the atmosphere has first become filled with carbon dioxide, then followed by what I call a methane bloom that we now know comes from two sources. One is a release of methane in the as permafrost melts, and then a massive release of methane from that is now trapped in under the sea floor as the waters of the ocean get warmer. This causes a temperature spike more dramatic than anything we have yet seen. We will see the day in our lifetime when temperatures at the North Pole reach 80 degrees, and we will experience this same process of extraordinary warming and snap back to an ice age. This will happen, and it might even unfold in our lifetimes. In fact, it could unfold really in the next 20 years quite easily, or even sooner, because mankind has sped up the process, and probably also for the intensity of it.
Right, we are poking it with sticks, as Wally Brokers.
Local ad campaign going on for the paperback edition, I believe, of your book Communion, and initially just involved the grey alien face that appears on the cover of your book, and when they saw that, they were quite staggered, because particularly Vivian, because she said, "This is what you've been telling me about," referring to her fiancé, and so they couldn't understand what this was about, because the campaign was somewhat subtle and clever in the sense that it started off just with the face, and then eventually, after a week or so, it became clear that it was linked to the book, and then when they got hold of the book, Vivian started reading it first, and she kept telling Peter that you're not going to believe this. This is exactly what you've been telling me, and eventually did read the book, and obviously was quite startled. And at least when he got the book, he somehow had some sort of anchor point now that at least he felt that this book, or at least his experience, was something to do with alien abductions. But up till that point, he just wasn't familiar with the field at all.
It's interesting how these books have worked, because the book that set me off on this particular journey was one that my brother, for some bizarre reason, gave me for Christmas that year, in the Christmas of 1985, a book by Jenny Randalls, and I had no more idea of the concept of alien abduction than the man in the moon at that time. I would have scoffed at anyone who said such a thing. And, to me, alien abduction and such, it was something that had to do with backwoods people, trailers, and big cases of beer.
That was clear and explicit and recollected without the benefit of hypnosis. It was just a powerfully sort of life-changing experience. But as he started to try and understand that experience, he started to, like yourself, go back into his own past, and the one experience that seems to stand out as a kind of focal point, or was an experience that he had as a child back in 1971 in Lebanon, and that involved him with a number of other children from the local community at Cheka, a seaside port in Lebanon. They were playing, as most kids do, on the flat top roofs of the buildings, the houses there, most of them are flat top. And he clearly recollects being the last to go up the staircase, going through the heavy door up onto the roof. And then as he gets through the heavy door onto the roof, he sees that all his friends are frozen like statues, and he looks up and appears to see what he first took to be like a helicopter, but a helicopter nothing like that he'd ever seen before. Most things that are unusual in the sky in those days are all put down to the activities of Israelis, etc. Because it was the period of conflict between the Israelis and the Lebanese and Arabic communities there. All he could recollect was that he saw what appeared to be two people inside this sort of unusual object, virtually directly above the roof of the house, and it just seemed to be silently sitting there. And then the next thing he finds himself and all the other kids down at ground level with no recollection how they got there.
Blowing a little something on the side in the smoky realm, or even dropping some acid. But it had nothing to do with... go ahead.
This is one of the problems with Peter Curry, is that I know there's a lot of stereotyping that goes on with sort of abductees and what the community and general public think they might be, or what the media portrays them as, but really those stereotypes just aren't appropriate. And Peter was basically from the Lebanese community. His family immigrated to Australia in the early 80s, and as he grew up, he got into a sort of a building career in cement rendering, etc., and a fairly kind of strong kind of character, etc., with very strong kind of family ties, both his own Lebanese family and also to his wife's Greek community as well. And the idea of somebody with that background coming up with an alien abduction experience was just quite strikingly unreal in that sense. And yet here he is describing these experiences. And obviously there was some, attitude of unacceptance from his own family community eventually, but some of the members of his own family were in part witnesses to all these experiences as they slowly unraveled, and as they got into the story in a more detailed way, they realised that Peter was going through a genuine kind of experience.
Well, tell me this: what did he notice in his life? What was he complaining of, and what was he experiencing?
Well, the thing obviously that started it all in terms of the UFO alien context was his 1988 experience.
Lots of publications, Rolling Stone, Reader's Digest. He's written quite a book about the Australian UFO community and the UFO story in Australia, the Oz Files, and now he's got a new one out, Hair of the Alien. And are you sitting down? We're going to be talking today about DNA and forensic evidence of alien abduction. Is it out there? And well, Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Whitley.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you with us. Let's see how we can get into this. Let me just start out by reading something from the frontispiece of Bill's book. The thing is that when I bit her, she didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't react at all in pain. It was as if I took a bite out of a plastic dummy or a mannequin or that was made of rubber or something. The expression on her face was like, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. This isn't the way it's supposed to happen.
It's an extraordinary and a bizarre case, and like so many abduction cases worldwide, I guess one sort of initial reaction, if you're not sort of familiar with this territory, is to kind of reject it. But what we did there was to examine the case because it was not just a story. It had some physical evidence, and fortunately that evidence was of a biological nature, and we could apply some DNA techniques to it to try and unravel what the story was all about.
Now, this is the Curry case, from the Curry case, am I correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about it. Now, what we're going to be talking here, folks. Understand, this is not a story about alien abductions and sort of what went down only. That's part of it. But the biggest part of this story is forensic evidence is being collected now, folks. The world's changing fast. So, Bill, tell us a little bit about this case first.
Well, I first got to know Peter Curry around about late 91, 92. Essentially, I'd heard that he had an experience rather similar to your own experience that you documented in Communion back in 1987. He had his experience before he became aware of your book, so when he actually was exposed to your book, he was quite startled by the similarities. But of course, there was also a lot of dissimilarities. So, like in many cases, etc., there are always common elements and dissimilar elements. But so he had this experience back in 1988, which involved what appeared to be the traditional grey type beings, perhaps slightly taller than usual, and the smaller, stocky, darker figures, etc., which involved putting a needle-like probe into his head, and that experience was just, extraordinarily frightening for him, and it literally shattered his entire kind of world view. And
I can speak from experience that there's nothing like having a needle stuck into your head to make you feel a little uneasy.
Yes,
I've been there and done that.
Yes, he was like you, absolutely terrified that. Totally uncertain what this was all about, and it was in fact while he was driving with his fiancée Vivian that there was a